My first impression of the human diplomatic delegation was one of inherent chaos. Not overt, not disruptive, but a low-frequency hum of disequilibrium that permeated their very presence. To my crystalline senses, attuned to the perfect, logical harmony of the Dominion, they were a discordant symphony. Their bodies, soft and asymmetrical, were a constant flux of motion. The twitch of a digit, the subtle shift of weight, the ceaseless blinking of fluid-coated optical sensors. Their communication was a layered cacophony of sonic vibrations overlaid with a constant, unreadable broadcast of thermal and biochemical signals. It was, to be direct, inefficient. I am Zethkar, third emitter of the geode of Xylos, designated envoy to this nascent species. My form, a bipedal structure of interlocking silicon lattices, remained perfectly still in the reception chamber of the neutral station, Nexus. Within my torso, my core lattice pulsed with the steady, cool blue light of placid observation. The human ambassador, a male designated Arthur Thorne, extended a five-fingered appendage. My pre-summit briefing data had prepared me for this ritual. The handshake, a symbolic gesture of non-aggression, rooted in an ancient practice of demonstrating one was not carrying a concealed weapon. Primitive, yet a required formality. I extended my own three-taloned manipulator, the crystalline tips carefully blunted for interspecies contact. The sensation was unsettling. His skin was warm, yielding, and damp with minute secretions. A cascade of biochemical data flooded my contact sensors, trace proteins, salinity levels, pheromonal markers. It was an unfiltered torrent of biological information, far more than the clean, resonant data pulses exchanged between my own kind. Ambassador Zethkar, Thorne's voice resonated, the sound waves vibrating through the station's nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere. On behalf of the Terran Alliance, welcome to Nexus. We trust your journey was satisfactory. Ambassador Thorne, I replied, my own voice a series of modulated chimes produced by vibrating resonant crystals in my vocalization chamber. The journey was efficient. Transit time was within 0.01% of projections. We anticipate these negotiations will proceed with similar precision. A flicker of something crossed his face. The muscles around his optical sensors tightened, and the edges of his mouth curved slightly upward. The briefing data labeled this a smile, a sign of approval or welcome. Yet the accompanying micro-expressions and the fleeting spike in his cortisol output suggested something more complex. Amusement, perhaps, or was it condescension? The sheer ambiguity was maddening. Beside him stood a smaller human, a female identified in the manifest as Protocol Officer Ilara Vance. She observed the exchange with a focused stillness that was unusual for her species. Her thermal signature was calmer, her movements more deliberate. She registered my analysis of Thorne's expression and offered a minimal, almost imperceptible inclination of her head. It was a signal I could not yet parse, but I stored the data point for later correlation. The geode of Xylos had tasked me with a mission of supreme importance: to secure the trade agreement for hyperconductive crystals from the asteroid belt the humans called Ceres. Our models showed it was the most logical source, and our offer was mathematically equitable, based on mass, energy expenditure of extraction, and projected market value. The logic was flawless. The protocol, however, was an ocean of variables for which I had only a crude map. We convened in the primary negotiation chamber. The room was a study in human compromise. The lighting was adjustable, the atmospheric composition a precise blend to accommodate both our physiologies, and the table itself was a polished slab of neutral alloy. I sat opposite Thorne, flanked by my two aides, Ithler and Jaina, their crystalline forms glowing with the faint white light of focused attention. Thorne was flanked by his own team, including Officer Vance, who sat slightly behind him, her gaze fixed on a data slate. I initiated the proceedings by projecting our proposal directly onto the table's holographic display. Lattices of data, flow charts of resource allocation, and timelines calculated to the microsecond filled the space between us. My own form pulsed with a gentle, violet light, the crystalline frequency for proposal of mutual benefit. As you can see, Ambassador, my chimes resonated, The Dominion's offer is based on a foundational principle of logical equity. We will provide the Terran Alliance with 20 standardized units of our energy-focusing technology in exchange for extraction rights to 73% of the series, Belt's crystalline deposits for a cycle of 100 of your solar years. I expected a counterproposal, a logical debate on the finer points of the percentages or the timeline. That was the dance of negotiation as I understood it, an exchange of data until an optimal equilibrium was reached. Thorn leaned forward. His thermal signature began to fluctuate, a slow burn of rising heat originating from his core. 73%, he said, his voice lower than before. For 100 years, you're asking for exclusive control over a resource in our sovereign territory. The term sovereign territory is an interesting one for unclaimed stellar bodies, I noted, my light remaining a calm violet. Our proposal is based on the value of the technology offered. It is a one-to-one exchange, mathematically verified. Mathematically verified, Thorn repeated the words as if they were a foreign substance in his mouth. He laughed, a short, sharp bark of sound that my processors flagged as anomalous. It did not correlate with any known positive emotional indicators. Your technology is valuable, I'll grant you that. But Ceres isn't just a rock ambassador. It's a symbol, it's the next frontier for our people. There are colonists on that rock, families building a future. You're asking us to sign over their future to your corporation. We are not a corporation. We are the Crystalline Dominion, I corrected, shifting my internal light to a slightly deeper shade of violet, indicating a point of clarification. And the presence of your colonists was factored into the equation. Their settlements occupy less than 0.03% of the asteroid's surface area. Our extraction activities will not interfere with their operations. Thorn stared at me. The small muscles around his eyes tightened again, but this time it was not a smile. The skin on his face began to change color, a subtle mottling of red spreading from his neck up to his cheeks. His breathing rate increased, and my audio sensors picked up the accelerated thumping of his primary circulatory pump. I cataloged the symptoms clinically. System instability, a potential biological malfunction. Factored in, he said, his voice now dangerously quiet. You factored in their lives as a statistical rounding error. It is not a rounding error, I replied, attempting to bring the conversation back to a logical footing. It is a precise variable in a complex calculation. Their presence is acknowledged and accounted for. And then it happened, the protocol breach. Thorn slammed his soft, fleshy hand down onto the metal table. The sound was a percussive shockwave, completely outside the accepted parameters of diplomatic discourse. The impact caused the holographic display to flicker. "To hell with your calculations," he roared. The sheer volume was startling, a blast of sonic energy designed to overwhelm, not communicate. His face was now a deep, uniform crimson. The veins on his neck and forehead stood out in sharp relief. His entire body trembled with fine, high-frequency vibrations. "We are not variables in your damned equation, Zethkar. We are people. You come here with your cold, crystalline logic and expect us to just roll over and hand you the keys to our future. Is there anything behind that glittering facade of yours, or is it just gears and numbers all the way down?" I was silent. My internal processors were racing, trying to categorize this event. It was not aggression in the tactical sense. He had not made a move to cause physical harm. It was not a communication of data. His words were rife with logical fallacies and emotional hyperbole. It was a complete system failure, a catastrophic breakdown of rational behavior. My own light flickered and died, leaving my form a dull, semi-translucent gray, the crystalline sign of profound confusion and system shock. My aides, Ithler and Jaina, mirrored my state instantly. We sat there, three lightless statues, observing a biological organism in the throes of a violent, inexplicable malfunction. Thorn stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the deck plating. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "This meeting is over. When you're ready to discuss this with a shred of respect for what it means to be human, you know where to find me." He turned and strode out of the room, his movements stiff and jerky. His delegation, after a moment of stunned silence, gathered their things and followed. Only one remained, Protocol Officer Ilara Vance. She stood by the table, her face a mask of something my databanks could not identify. It looked like a mixture of apology, frustration, and something else, fatigue. She looked at me, at my gray, unlit form. I apologize for the ambassador's outburst, she said, her voice quiet. Outburst? I repeated the word, my chimes flat. I accessed its definition in my human language database. A sudden release of strong emotion. Was the ambassador's display a tactical maneuver? An attempt to intimidate us into a more favorable position by simulating irrationality? Ilara Vance looked at me, and for the first time, I felt I was being truly seen, not just observed as an alien curiosity. A deep sigh escaped her, a slow release of atmospheric gases. No, Ambassador, she said, her weariness palpable. That wasn't a tactic, that was genuine, that was anger. The word echoed in my processing core. Anger. A state of being so alien, so counterproductive, that the crystalline dominion had no direct equivalent. We had historical records of the age of fracture, a dark time before the Great Clarity when our ancestors were supposedly slaves to chaotic resonance patterns, but the concept was abstract, a ghost story to reinforce the value of logic. To see it manifest, raw and unrestrained, in another sentient being was like witnessing a star go supernova in a sealed room. It was terrifying in its sheer pointlessness. The negotiations were in ruins, not because of a flaw in the data, but because of a flaw in the diplomat. And I, Zethkar, had absolutely no protocol for dealing with it. Back in our designated quarters, the silence was absolute. Ithler and Jaina remained in their passive, gray state, awaiting my lead. My own form was a maelstrom of cycling, muted colors, a visual representation of my chaotic thought processes. I replayed the recording of the meeting, isolating the moment of the breach. I analyzed Thorne's biometric data, the spike in adrenaline and norepinephrine, the elevated blood pressure, the constriction of his pupils followed by a rapid dilation. Every indicator pointed to a severe stress response, a fight-or-flight trigger. Yet there was no physical threat. The only threat was a set of data points on a holographic display. It is a defense mechanism, Jaina chimed softly, her light shifting to a tentative green of hypothesizing. The human perceives a threat to its collective's resources and initiates a physiological state of readiness for conflict. But there was no conflict, Ithler countered, her form glowing a pale, analytical blue. Only discourse. To trigger such a damaging biological cascade in response to numbers and words is a critical design flaw. It is like detonating a fusion reactor to power a single light source. The energy expenditure is wildly disproportionate to the stimulus. And it is self-damaging, I added, my own light settling on a deep, troubled purple. Our long-range scans of their species indicate that prolonged exposure to these hormonal floods leads to cellular degradation, circulatory system failure, and decreased lifespan. They are actively shortening their existence by engaging in this anger. We dissected the event for hours, approaching it from every conceivable angle, biological, sociological, game theory. Every path led to the same conclusion. Ambassador Thorne's behavior was a net negative for his own objectives. He had terminated the negotiation, damaged diplomatic relations, and gained nothing. From a crystalline perspective, it was the definition of insanity. Yet Officer Vance had called it genuine. That word implied it was a natural, expected part of the human condition. If that were true, then our entire understanding of this species was fundamentally flawed. We were not dealing with occasionally irrational logicians. We were dealing with a species for whom irrationality was a core component of their operating system. I needed more data. The pre-summit briefing packets were sterile, focusing on etiquette, language, and political structures. They contained nothing of substance about the messy, chaotic reality of human emotion. I needed a guide, a translator for this alien inner world. My thoughts coalesced around Protocol Officer Ilara Vance. She had remained calm. She had apologized for her superior's behavior. She possessed a degree of control that suggested she understood the phenomenon, perhaps even knew how to manage it. She was the logical choice. I re-energized my communication systems and sent a formal request to the human delegation. My message was precise, and I hoped, devoid of any judgment that might trigger another outburst. To Protocol Officer Ilara Vance, I request a private consultation at your earliest convenience to discuss the procedural breakdown in today's session. Specifically, I require clarification on the nature of the emotional state designated as anger and its role in human diplomatic protocol. Zethkar, third emitter. The response came within minutes. Ambassador Zethkar, I can meet you in 1 hour in the station's arboretum. It is a neutral, informal setting. Vance. The arboretum was an entire section of the station dedicated to the cultivation of terrestrial flora. The air was thick with humidity and the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers, a stark contrast to the sterile, recycled atmosphere of the rest of Nexus. For a being of crystal and light, it was an overwhelmingly organic environment. Water dripped from broad, green leaves. Insects with iridescent wings flitted through the air, their buzzing a constant, low-level static. It was an ecosystem of controlled chaos, much like the humans themselves. I found Ilara Vance standing by a small, trickling waterfall, watching colorful fish swim in a pool below. She was not in her formal uniform, but in simple, soft-textured garments. Her posture was relaxed, and for the first time I could analyze her baseline biometrics without the stress of the negotiation chamber. Her heart rate was steady, her breathing slow and even. She was in a state of equilibrium. Officer Vance, I chimed, my light a neutral white of formal inquiry. She turned, offering that slight upward curve of her lips. This time it felt different, less a social formality and more something else. My database offered welcoming. Ambassador, please call me Ilara. In a place like this, titles feel a bit heavy. Ilara, I tested the sound. As you wish, my designation is Zethkar. Zethkar, she nodded. You wanted to talk about anger. Correct, I confirmed. I wish to understand it. Is it a weapon, a negotiating tool, a pathology? Ilara let out another one of those slow exhalations. A sigh. I was beginning to learn it was a marker of her having to explain something complex and perhaps frustrating. It's all of those and none of them. It's a feeling, an emotion. It's a response to a perceived injustice or threat. Ambassador Thorne perceived our proposal as an injustice. He did, she said simply. You talked about the colonists on Ceres as a precise variable. To him, to most humans, that sounds like you're dismissing their lives, their dreams. You weren't speaking his language. I was speaking the language of mathematics. It is the only universal language. It's not, she countered gently. Math can describe the universe, but it can't describe the experience of living in it. Not for us. For humans, value isn't always logical. A child's drawing has no practical function, but a parent might risk their life to save it from a fire. That's not logical. It's emotional. Ceres isn't just 73% of a rock to us. It represents hope, independence, a future for our children. When you reduced all of that to a number, Thorne felt you were devaluing not just the asteroid, but our entire identity. My internal lattices shifted, processing this new information. It was like trying to add a new, irrational axiom to a perfect geometric proof. The entire structure threatened to collapse. So his anger was a response to a perceived disregard for this emotional value. Exactly, Ilara said, her tone becoming more like that of a teacher. Anger is a signal. It says you have crossed a line. What you are doing is not acceptable. Sometimes, yes, it's a tactic. Some politicians use manufactured outrage to manipulate people, but Thorne, his was real. He felt that you, and by extension the Crystalline Dominion, saw humanity as nothing more than an obstacle in a resource acquisition algorithm. I modulated my light to a pale yellow, the color of data assimilation. That is a regrettable interpretation. Our intent was to demonstrate the logic and fairness of our offer, not to denigrate your species' aspirations. I know, she said, but intent and impact are two different things, Zethkar. That's one of the first lessons in human diplomacy. You can have the most logical, well-intentioned proposal in the universe, but if it makes the other side feel disrespected or threatened, the logic ceases to matter. We stood in silence for a moment, the only sounds the water and the insects. I focused on a single drop of water as it fell from a leaf and struck the pool, creating ripples that expanded and distorted the reflection of the lights above. A perfect, singular event, creating a cascade of unpredictable, chaotic results. A metaphor. How, I began, my chimes softer than before, does one negotiate with emotion? It is an unquantifiable variable. It does not conform to predictable models. You learn to read it, Alara explained. You watch the body language, you listen to the tone of voice, not just the words. You learn to recognize the signs before the outburst, and you learn empathy. Empathy, I repeated, accessing the definition. The ability to understand and share the feelings of another. I cannot share a feeling I am incapable of experiencing. Then you learn the next best thing, she said, turning to face me fully. Her expression was serious intent. You learn to acknowledge it. You don't have to feel what Thorn feels. But you have to understand that he is feeling it, and you have to show him that you understand. You have to say, I see that this is important to you. I see that my proposal has caused you distress. Let's talk about that. You have to validate the emotion before you can get back to the logic. Validate the emotion. The concept was utterly alien. In the Dominion, if a being exhibited illogical resonance patterns, they were corrected. Their data was realigned with the collective harmony. The idea of validating a flawed process was counterintuitive. It was like telling a corrupted data file that its errors were legitimate. I will require more data, I stated. Examples, historical precedents, training materials. Alara actually smiled then, a genuine, unforced expression that was accompanied by a corresponding dip in her cortisol levels. I can get you access to our cultural archives. History, literature, films, it's the best way to understand us. We're a species of storytellers. You'll learn more about human nature from one of our great tragedies than from 1,000 psych reports. Tragedies, I mused. You codify and study narratives of profound failure and suffering. We do, she confirmed without a hint of shame. Sometimes we learn the most from our greatest pains. This species was an ever-expanding puzzle box of contradictions. They shortened their lives with self-destructive emotions, yet they revered stories about suffering. They were capable of building starships that bent spacetime, yet their decisions could be derailed by a perceived insult. They were chaotic, illogical, and impossibly complex. And as I stood there in that artificial jungle, a silent, crystalline being far from the perfect harmony of my home, I felt the first glimmer of something I could not name. It wasn't an emotion. It was a logical imperative, a driving need to solve the most difficult equation I had ever encountered, the human heart. The cultural archive Alara provided was a deluge. I interfaced my core processor directly with the station's network and began to absorb millennia of human history, art, and philosophy. It was a brutal, disorienting experience. For a mind accustomed to the pristine elegance of data and the pure harmony of logic, it was like being submerged in a roiling sea of raw, unfiltered sensation. I began with history. I witnessed the rise and fall of empires, driven by greed, pride, and fear, all variations on the chaotic energy I had seen in Thorn. I saw wars fought over symbols, over ideologies, over insults. Millions of lives extinguished not for tangible resources, but for abstract concepts of honor and destiny. I saw acts of breathtaking cruelty juxtaposed with acts of profound self-sacrifice, often performed by the same individuals. A human could condemn a city to burn and then risk their own life to save a single child. The inconsistency was staggering. Then I moved to their fiction, their stories. Alara had recommended a creator named Shakespeare. I consumed his entire collection of works in 17.34 standard minutes. It was profoundly disturbing. The narratives were propelled by jealousy, revenge, grief, and a volatile, obsessive state they called love. Characters made catastrophic decisions based on emotional impulses, leading to ruin and death. Yet the humans classified these as masterpieces. They celebrated these tales of logical failure. I analyzed a film genre they called action. In these narratives, a protagonist often faced overwhelming odds. In the critical moment, they would access a state of extreme anger, which, contrary to all biological reason, seemed to grant them increased strength, endurance, and focus, allowing them to defeat their antagonists. They had weaponized their biological malfunction, turning a flaw into a feature. This was the key. I began to form a new hypothesis. For the crystalline dominion, the great clarity had been achieved by excising chaotic emotion, treating it as a cancer to be removed for the health of the collective. But for humans, emotion was not a cancer. It was a volatile, high-yield power source. It could lead to destruction, yes, but it could also fuel innovation, courage, and creation. Anger could lead to a senseless war, but righteous indignation against injustice could also lead to a revolution that freed millions. Love could lead to jealous rage, but it could also inspire an individual to build a better world for their offspring. They had not excised the chaos. They had, for better or for worse, learned to ride the storm. My internal lights pulsed with a rapid, multi-hued pattern of intense processing. I cross-referenced this new understanding with the data from the first negotiation. Thorne's anger was not just a reaction to the perceived insult of reducing colonists to a variable. It was a defense of his species' core identity. The hope, independence, and future he spoke of were the very things that this volatile emotional energy was meant to protect. Our logical proposal, in its cold perfection, had inadvertently threatened the fuel source of their civilization. Armed with this new, terrifying perspective, I agreed to a second negotiation. I requested that Alara be present, not just as a protocol officer, but as an official liaison and interpreter, not of language but of context. Thorne agreed, a concession that Alara informed me was a significant sign of de-escalation. We met in the same room. The tension was a palpable force, a static charge in the air. Thorne's biometrics were already elevated, his posture rigid. He was primed for another outburst. My aides, Ithler and Jaina, glowed with a low, cautious amber light. I decided to begin differently. I did not project a single chart or number. Instead, I dimmed my internal light to a soft, neutral blue, a color their own artists often associated with calm. Ambassador Thorne, my chimes began, modulated to a lower, less percussive frequency. Before we resume, I must address the conclusion of our previous meeting. My initial proposal was constructed from a foundation of pure logic. This is the way of the crystalline dominion. It is our strength and, I now understand, our significant limitation. Thorne watched me, his expression unreadable, his arms crossed over his chest in a defensive posture. I have since been granted access to your cultural archives, I continued. I have studied your history and your art. I do not claim to understand the human experience, but I have come to a new conclusion. My proposal, while mathematically equitable, failed to account for variables that cannot be quantified. It failed to account for what you term hope. I paused. The room was silent. I could feel Alara's gaze on me, steady and encouraging. The colonists on Ceres are not a rounding error, I stated clearly. They are the manifestation of your species' drive to expand, to build, to create a future. In failing to acknowledge this, I committed a protocol breach. I offered data where respect was required. For this, I apologize. The word apologize hung in the air. For a member of the Dominion to admit fault in a logical conclusion was unprecedented. It was tantamount to a geometric proof, admitting it had miscalculated an angle. Ithler and Jaina flickered with a brief, sharp pulse of white light, the crystalline equivalent of a gasp. Thorne's posture softened almost imperceptibly. The rigid set of his shoulders eased. He uncrossed his arms. "Apology accepted, Ambassador," he said, his voice even. "It takes courage to admit that. Perhaps we can start again." The second round of negotiations was entirely different. It was slower, more deliberate. I did not present my arguments as immutable facts, but as points for discussion. When we reached the topic of the colonists, instead of presenting data on their minimal land use, I asked a question. "Help me understand," I chimed, my light a soft yellow of inquiry. "What are the specific concerns your administration has regarding the coexistence of our extraction operations and your colonial settlements?" Thorne, no longer on the defensive, began to speak. He talked about the psychological impact on the colonists of seeing massive, alien machinery on their horizon. He spoke of fears of environmental contamination, however slight. He spoke of the political need for the Terran Alliance to be seen as the protector of its frontier citizens. These were all things my initial algorithm had dismissed as non-critical emotional noise. But now I listened. I recorded. I acknowledged. "These are valid concerns," I replied when he had finished. "Let us address them. We can restrict our operations to the far side of the asteroid out of sight of the primary settlement. Our technology is clean. We can provide full, transparent environmental monitoring data in real time. And in the treaty, we can include a clause formally recognizing the Terran Alliance's absolute authority and responsibility for the well-being of its citizens on Ceres." This was the turning point. By validating the emotion, as Alara had put it, I had transformed an obstacle into a set of solvable problems. We spent the next several hours working through the details. I learned to watch for the subtle cues. A tightening of Thorne's jaw meant he was feeling pressured. A slight, quick nod from Alara meant I was on the right track. I was learning to navigate the chaotic currents of human interaction, not with logic alone, but with a new, hybrid approach of logic and observation. We concluded the day with a tentative agreement, a framework that was far more complex and less mathematically perfect than my original proposal, but one that was infinitely more likely to succeed. As we were leaving, Thorne stopped me. "Zethkar," he said, extending his hand again. This time when I took it, I did not just register the thermal and biochemical data. I registered the context. The pressure of his grip was firm, a sign of confidence. His skin was dry, his biometrics were stable. This was not just a ritual, it was a communication, a non-verbal signal of mutual respect. "Thorne," I chimed in return. Over the next few days, we ironed out the treaty's finer points. My conversations with Alara continued. We met in the Arboretum, which had become our unofficial meeting place. She taught me about humor, a concept I found utterly baffling, the intentional creation of logical inconsistencies to provoke a spontaneous, convulsive respiratory reaction called laughter. She explained sarcasm, the art of saying the opposite of what one meant, a practice that seemed designed to maximize miscommunication. In return, I explained the great clarity to her. I described our world, a planet of crystalline cities that sang in harmonic resonance with the planet's core. I described the Dominion, not as a government, but as a single, unified consciousness, a geode of trillions of individual crystals all contributing to a perfect whole. I explained how our communication through light allowed for the instantaneous and flawless transmission of pure data, free from the ambiguity and misinterpretation inherent in sonic language. "So you never misunderstand each other?" she asked, her eyes wide with a look I identified as wonder. "Misunderstanding is a function of imprecise language," I explained. "Our language is precision itself. We share thoughts as clearly as you might share a physical object. But do you ever disagree?" "Of course," I pulsed. "We debate competing logical frameworks. We analyze different paths to an optimal solution. But the debate is about the data, not the self. There is no ego to be threatened. Once the superior logic is identified, all nodes of the geode align with it instantly and without reservation." "No pride," she murmured, almost to herself. "No resentment. Those are artifacts of emotional processing," I said. "They are inefficient, they hinder progress." "Maybe," she conceded, looking out at the chaotic greenery of the Arboretum. "Or maybe they're the grit in the oyster that makes the pearl. Maybe the friction is what makes us grow." I did not have a logical response to that. It was a poetic metaphor, not a data-based argument, but I stored it. The idea that imperfection and friction could be generative was another piece of the human puzzle. The day of the official treaty signing arrived. A third party had been invited to witness and ratify the agreement. The Skrell Conclave, a reptilian species known for their rigid adherence to protocol and their mercantile prowess. Their ambassador, a tall, imposing being named Vorlag, observed the proceedings with an unnerving stillness. The ceremony was held in the station's grand hall. Ambassador Thorne and I sat at a large, ceremonial desk. The final treaty, inscribed on a data crystal and a traditional human parchment for symbolic purposes, lay between us. All that remained were the formal signatures. Just as Thorne was about to sign, Ambassador Vorlag spoke, his voice a dry, rasping hiss. "A commendable agreement," he said, his unblinking eyes fixed on Thorne. "Though one must wonder at the concessions the mighty Terran Alliance was forced to make. To be so, Intimidated by a species that has only just mastered interstellar travel speaks volumes about your current position in the galaxy. The air in the room went cold. It was a deliberate, calculated insult, a probe to test the stability of the new human-crystalline relationship. My sensors immediately detected the shift in Thorn. His heart rate tripled in the space of 2 seconds. The crimson flush returned to his face with terrifying speed, far faster than before. His hand, which had been holding the signing stylus, clenched into a fist, the knuckles turning white. All my progress, all my learning, was about to be obliterated by a single, malicious sentence. The protocol breach was imminent. This would be worse than the first time. A public display of anger in front of a third party would not just scuttle the treaty. It would brand humans as unstable and unreliable partners on the galactic stage. Thorn's career would be over. Relations between our species would be shattered. Ilara shot me a look of pure panic. My own logical processors were screaming warnings. The old Zethkar would have retreated into gray silence, observing the inevitable system failure. But I was not the old Zethkar. I had analyzed Shakespeare. I had studied the weaponization of emotion. And I had learned from Ilara that the best way to diffuse an emotion was to validate and redirect it. I had to act. I had to do something completely outside of crystalline protocol. I rose from my seat, my crystalline form drawing every eye in the room. I turned not to Thorn, but to Vorlag. And I let my internal light flare into a brilliant, incandescent crimson, a color I had synthesized from studying human depictions of rage. It was a shocking, violent display, utterly alien to my species, placid light spectrum. "Ambassador Vorlag," I chimed, my voice resonating with a sharp, cutting edge I had never used before. I was mimicking, not feeling, but the effect was potent. "Your observation is noted, and your assessment of the Terran Alliance's strength is as flawed as your understanding of this treaty." Vorlag was taken aback, his composure momentarily broken. No one had expected the calm, logical crystalline to display such a passionate color. I then turned to Thorn. He was staring at me, his own rage momentarily frozen by my display. I shifted my light, softening the crimson into a deep, steady scarlet, a color I had learned humans associated with courage and strength, not just anger. "Ambassador Thorn," I continued, my chimes now firm and supportive. "Ambassador Vorlag's attempt to provoke you is a testament to his fear. He fears this alliance. He fears the combination of human ingenuity and Dominion resources. He sees what we have built here, a bridge of mutual respect, and he wishes to tear it down for his own mercantile advantage. Do not grant him the satisfaction of a victory he has not earned." Then I did what Ilara had taught me. I validated his emotion. "Your anger is justified," I said clearly, the scarlet light pulsing in time with my words. "You have been insulted. Your people have been insulted, but a true display of strength is not the eruption of that anger. It is the control of it. It is the choice to wield it as a tool, not to be consumed by it as a fire." I slowly turned back to Vorlag, my scarlet light dimming to a cool, dismissive blue. "The Skrell Conclave is welcome to observe the signing of our treaty, but they will not undermine it. This accord is not a sign of weakness. It is the beginning of a new strength in this quadrant." I looked back at Thorn. The deep red was receding from his face. His breathing was slowing. He looked from me to the trembling fist on the table, and slowly, deliberately, he uncurled his fingers. He picked up the stylus. The rage in his eyes had been replaced by a steely, focused resolve. He had taken the chaotic energy of his anger and forged it into a weapon, just as the heroes in his stories did. He directed that focused energy at Vorlag. "My colleague Zethkar is correct," Thorn said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that was far more intimidating than his previous shouting. "Your attempt to sabotage these proceedings has been noted, Ambassador, and it will be remembered." Without breaking eye contact with the Skrell, Thorn turned to the parchment and signed his name with a firm, confident flourish. He then pushed the treaty across the desk to me. I resumed my seat, my internal light returning to its calm, placid violet. I took the human stylus, an archaic but meaningful tool, and inscribed my own crystalline glyph beside Thorn's signature. The treaty was signed. The alliance was forged. A crisis had been averted not by ignoring emotion, but by acknowledging it, channeling it, and transforming it into a foundation of strength. Later that evening, Alara and I stood once again in the arboretum, watching the simulated stars appear in the dome above. The station was quiet. The Skrell delegation had departed with a terse, formal farewell. The human and crystalline teams were celebrating their hard-won success. "What you did in there today, Zethkar," Alara began, her voice filled with an emotion I was now able to identify as awe. "That wasn't in any protocol manual." "Indeed," I chimed. "It was an improvisation based on an analysis of your tragic literature and action-oriented cinema, a highly illogical course of action by my people's standards." "It was the most logical thing you could have done," she said, smiling. "You didn't just save the treaty, you showed Thorn that you understood him. You showed him respect in a way that 1,000 logical arguments never could. You spoke his language." "I am still learning the grammar," I admitted. "You're a fast learner," she replied. She reached out and placed her warm, soft hand on my crystalline forearm. In the past, the contact would have been a jarring flood of unwelcome data. Now I recognized it for what it was: a simple, non-verbal transmission, a signal of gratitude, of partnership, a gesture of friendship. My own light, unbidden by any conscious command, shifted to a soft, warm, golden hue, a color I had never produced before. It was not a color from the Dominion's logical spectrum, nor was it a mimicry of a human emotion. It was something new, a resonance pattern created by the interaction of two vastly different, yet compatible systems. "Alara," I said, analyzing the new light pulsing within me, "I believe I have discovered a new axiom. Logic is the framework of the universe, but it is not the entire picture. There are truths that can only be understood through connection." She simply nodded, her hand still on my arm. We stood in comfortable silence, a crystalline being of pure logic and a human woman of chaotic emotion, watching the artificial stars. The negotiations were over, but our work was just beginning. I had been sent here to secure a trade deal. I was returning as something more. I was a translator, a bridge, an ambassador not just between two governments, but between two fundamentally different ways of experiencing the universe. And for the first time, I understood that the gaps between us were not empty spaces to be feared, but opportunities for a harmony more complex and beautiful than logic alone could ever create.